In 1966, an engineer named Ralph Baer looked at the most popular machine in America, the television, and noticed something nobody else had. 40 million of them, 40 million living rooms, and all anyone ever did was sit and watch. So he asked a question nobody had thought to ask: what if you could play? His bosses thought it was a waste of a perfectly good television. The machine he built would barely sell. It would be laughed out of stores. And then, a decade later, it would be declared dead, buried literally in a desert. This is the story of how it took over the living room anyway. This is the history of the game console. Baer worked at a defense contractor, sketching his idea mostly in secret. What came out was an unglamorous tangle of plywood and wire his team called, simply, the brown box. It could do almost nothing. 2 dots and a line, a game of electronic ping pong. But it ran on any ordinary TV. Baer had found a way to make the television talk back. No toy company wanted it. Finally, in 1972, Magnavox licensed it and sold it as the Odyssey, the first home game console. It shipped with plastic overlays you taped onto your screen, because the machine couldn't even draw in color. A rumor spread that it only worked on Magnavox sets. It didn't. But the rumor stuck, and the Odyssey sold quietly, then faded. The father of the video game had built the future, and almost nobody noticed. But one person was watching. At a Magnavox demo, a young engineer named Nolan Bushnell played that electronic tennis and saw a business. His company, Atari, rebuilt the idea as a coin-operated arcade cabinet called Pong. The story goes the first machine broke down within days, jammed completely full of quarters. So the console's first real hit didn't happen in the living room at all. It happened in bars and arcades. Magnavox noticed the resemblance, sued, and won. Then in 1975, Atari squeezed Pong back into a home console and sold it through the Sears catalog, and it flew off the shelves. Games, it turned out, were something people would pay for twice, once at the arcade and again to bring home. But every early console had the same fatal flaw. The games came baked in, a fixed handful wired into the machine at the factory. Play through them, get bored, and the whole thing was a paperweight. The fix was the cartridge, a swappable sliver of plastic that let a single console play an endless, growing library. In 1977, Atari's VCS, later just the 2600, turned that idea into a phenomenon. Suddenly the console wasn't a product you finished. It was a platform you kept feeding. Space Invaders, Pac-Man, Pitfall. The box became a doorway, and the money poured through it. By 1982, video games were a multi-billion-dollar industry. Every arrow pointed up, and everyone in the business was certain it always would. It went down instead. Swimming in cash, companies pumped out hundreds of games, most of them terrible, shelves filled with junk, and shoppers lost the ability to tell the good from the garbage. The symbol of the whole mess was Atari's ET, rushed to market in about 5 weeks, barely playable, and returned by the truckload. Millions went unsold, and hundreds of thousands of cartridges were driven into the New Mexico desert and buried in a landfill. For 30 years, people thought that was just a legend. In 2014, someone dug them up. It was true. The North American market collapsed from over $3 billion to barely $100 million, nearly 97% gone. Retailers swore off video games for good. The console, everyone agreed, was a fad that had finally died. Its rescue came from the unlikeliest place, a company that had spent nearly a century making playing cards, in Kyoto, Japan. Nintendo. Nintendo saw that the real problem wasn't technology, it was trust. American stores wouldn't touch anything called a video game. So Nintendo refused to sell one. It sold a toy, the Nintendo Entertainment System, boxed with a robot and a light gun, shelved beside the action figures, nowhere near the poisoned electronics aisle. And to answer the flood of garbage, it stamped every approved game with a seal of quality, a promise that this one, at least, would actually work. Then it put Super Mario Bros. In players' hands. The console hadn't died. It had only needed someone to sell it differently. The console was alive again. And the next war wasn't about survival. It was about who you were. In 1989, Sega came for Nintendo with sharper hardware and an attitude to match. Its slogan was a straight-up schoolyard taunt. Genesis does what Nintendo does, and its mascot was a sneering blue hedgehog named Sonic, aimed square at Nintendo's cheerful Mario. For the first time, the box under your TV said something about you. Kids argued it on playgrounds. The console had become a team you rooted for, and a war the marketers were happy to keep selling. The next blow to Nintendo came from a partner it had betrayed. Nintendo had asked Sony to build it a CD add-on, then humiliated Sony by dumping the deal on stage at a trade show for a rival with no warning. Sony, furious, took the half-finished machine and finished it alone. The PlayStation arrived in the mid-1990s, and it changed what a console was. A disc held far more than a cartridge, so games grew up. Cinematic, moody, made for teenagers and adults instead of kids. Even its power-on sound was a statement. A slow, glowing chord tuned to feel less like a toy clicking on and more like a machine waking up. The console had left the toy aisle for good and moved into the living room as furniture. Then the console stopped being a lonely box in the corner. In 2001, Microsoft, a software company with no games pedigree, simply spent its way in with the Xbox and soon did the thing that mattered most. It put consoles online. Xbox Live turned strangers into rivals and teammates across the whole world and turned the console into something you no longer just owned, you subscribed to it. The hardware began to matter less than the network humming behind it. The living room box had quietly become a living room service. By the mid-2000s, everyone was racing to build the most powerful machine. Everyone except Nintendo, which zagged. Instead of chasing graphics, the Wii shipped a simple motion controller you swung like a tennis racket. It was weaker than its rivals, and it didn't care. Grandparents played it. Whole families played it. People who had never touched a console in their lives were suddenly on their feet in the living room, swinging at nothing. The audience for the game console had just quietly become everyone. And then the box began to vanish. Games stopped arriving on discs and started arriving as downloads, then as streams. No cartridge, no case, sometimes no console at all. Just a screen and a connection. The switch blurred the final line, sliding from the television into your hands and back again. The thing Ralph Baer built to live under the TV was dissolving back into the screen it came from. Baer lived to see most of it. He died in 2014, the same year they dug his industry's ghosts out of that desert landfill. Still tinkering, still the engineer who had looked at a television and refused to just watch. From a plywood box nobody wanted to a $200 billion habit in half a century. The game console never really took over the living room by winning. It survived over and over because someone kept reinventing what it was for. So here's our question for you. What everyday machine secret history should we dig into next?